He wasn't a slave, nor a petty criminal dragged to a cross. He was one of Rome's greatest generals, a man whose victories carved his name into the empire's very stone. And yet, rumor said he met his end flayed alive before a roaring crowd. Imagine that, skin torn from flesh, cheers rising as his body dissolved into agony. But here's the twist. This was no ordinary man, and his fate was no ordinary execution. It was a lesson in how power turns its champions into threats, and how legends can bury truth deeper than any grave. Lucius Quietus was not Roman by birth. He came from the fringes of the empire, a Berber prince from Mauritania, raised far from the marble halls of the Senate. To the Roman elite, men like him were barbarians, tools at best, expendable at worst. Yet his father had chosen Rome's side, securing citizenship for his family. And that single decision opened a path few outsiders ever dreamed of. Service in the Roman army, with the chance to rise beyond the limits of blood. Quietus seized that chance with a ferocity that terrified enemies and unsettled allies. He wasn't the type to obey blindly. His ambition burned too hot, his defiance too sharp. At first it cost him dearly: disgrace, dismissal, humiliation. For most, that would have been the end. But for Quietus, it was only the beginning, because soon Rome would find itself in need of a weapon. And who better than a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove? So I ask you, what's more dangerous? A loyal servant who follows every command, or an outsider who fights like he owns the empire itself? And if you were Rome, would you trust him, or destroy him? From the dusty edge of Mauritania, Lucius Quietus entered the Roman world with a mark already against him. He was not one of them. To senators in their villas, he was a reminder that the empire's power stretched too far, that even so-called barbarians could claim its prizes. Yet from the moment he set foot in the army, his skill was undeniable. He wasn't merely another auxiliary rider sent to die on the frontiers. He was a commander in the making, a man who could turn chaos into order with sheer will. He fought with a style that Romans admired but also feared. Reckless in appearance, yet devastating in effect. Soon he won equestrian rank, a leap that placed him closer to the aristocracy itself. It was a moment that should have been impossible for someone like him. Still, his pride and independence clashed with discipline. He refused to bow when tradition demanded obedience, and the punishment was swift: dismissal. To fall from such a height was often the death of a career. But here lies the contradiction that makes history fascinating. The very traits that got him cast out, his defiance, his raw drive, were the same ones Rome would later need. Because on the throne came a new emperor, Trajan, a soldier's ruler who valued victory above obedience. Where others saw a dangerous rogue, Trajan saw a weapon that could cut through Rome's most desperate struggles. It was his second chance, forged not by mercy, but by necessity. And with it, Quietus returned to the battlefield at the head of his own Moorish cavalry, men as fierce and unyielding as their commander. So here's the question: when a man rises again after disgrace, is it fate offering redemption, or simply sharpening the blade for a bloodier fall? The return of Lucius Quietus was not quiet, it was thunder on the battlefield. Leading his Moorish cavalry, bare-headed riders famed for their speed and ferocity, he carved fear into Rome's enemies. These men were not disciplined in the Roman sense. They fought like a storm, unpredictable and merciless. Under his command, they became a symbol of terror, and their victories etched Quietus into the empire's memory. His name was no longer that of a disgraced officer, it was the name of a commander who could bend chaos to his will. The proof of his rise still stands today. Carved into the spiraling reliefs of Trajan's column, Quietus and his horsemen are immortalized in stone. For Rome, this was more than decoration, it was propaganda. It showed an outsider now placed at the very core of imperial power, a living contradiction to the aristocracy's belief that only old Roman blood could command legions. His successes were rewarded with something unprecedented. Quietus was elevated to the Senate itself. Imagine the outrage among Rome's noble families. This Berber prince, once disgraced, now walked among the most exclusive rulers of the world. To them, he was a reminder that merit could sometimes outweigh birth. a dangerous precedent for those who guarded their privileges jealously. And yet, Quietus pressed forward. Victories followed victories, and his legend among soldiers grew. They trusted him, not because of titles, but because he won battles and kept them alive. To them, he was one of their own, a commander who earned respect in blood and dust. But tell me, when power shifts so quickly, when an outsider becomes a rival to the elite, what do you think happens next? Does envy simmer quietly, or does it sharpen itself into the kind of blade no soldier can defend against? As Trajan's empire stretched its borders to breaking, it was Lucius Quietus who stood ready to do what others would not. In Parthia, when Roman forces faced collapse, it was he who led a desperate rearguard, saving thousands from annihilation. That single act etched his name into the hearts of the legions. He was no longer merely a capable commander. He was their shield against certain death. Soldiers carried his name like a banner, whispering it with reverence around campfires. But glory is a double-edged sword. Every triumph on the battlefield tightened the noose in Rome. To the emperor, Quietus was indispensable. To the Senate, he was intolerable. They saw not just a general, but a man with an army of loyal riders, adored by the rank and file, and willing to act with a freedom that few dared. His victories in Mesopotamia, retaking cities, crushing uprisings, cemented his reputation. Yet with every honor came new whispers. What if he reached too high? What if he no longer served Rome, but himself? The irony is brutal. The very traits that made him a savior on campaign, ruthlessness, independence, loyalty from soldiers, made him a threat at home. His enemies did not need evidence of treason. His success was proof enough. On Trajan's column, he was immortalized, yes. But in the marble halls of power, he became a living warning. Outsiders were not supposed to reach such heights, and Quietus had shattered that rule. So ask yourself, if you were one of Rome's old families, watching this foreign-born commander rise above your bloodlines, would you accept him? Or would you plot his fall, no matter the cost? At the height of his power, Lucius Quietus seemed untouchable. He had risen from exile to stand among the empire's most feared commanders, trusted by Trajan himself for missions that demanded both brilliance and brutality. When rebellions flared in the east, it was Quietus who was sent to stamp them out. And he did so with a finality that stunned even hardened Romans. Cities that had risen against the empire were crushed, their leaders executed, their people scattered. In victory, he left silence, a silence born not of peace, but of terror. For the soldiers under him, this was proof of his greatness. They saw a man who did not waver, who never hesitated to strike when Rome demanded blood. For the Senate, however, each of these victories was a warning bell. Quietus was not just winning battles, he was shaping the empire's eastern frontier by his own will. He acted with the authority of an emperor in all but name, and that frightened men who valued control above conquest. Trajan rewarded him with even greater commands, elevating him to governorships and giving him authority over provinces that had long resisted Roman power. But behind the accolades lingered an unspoken truth. Each success widened the gap between Quietus and the aristocrats who despised him. He was no longer just a general, he was becoming a legend, and legends are dangerous in politics. So here is the question. When does a loyal servant of the state stop being seen as a protector and start being feared as a rival? And if you were in his place, would you have trusted Rome to honor your service? Or would you have seen the dagger being sharpened behind the curtain? At the peak of his career, Lucius Quietus stood as one of Rome's most indispensable commanders. He had saved legions from collapse, crushed rebellions, and proven that loyalty to the empire could come from its most distant fringes. His campaigns in the east were brutal but brilliant, and the soldiers who served under him spoke his name with respect, tinged by fear. They knew he was the man who would drive them into the fire, but also the man who would get them out alive. In this paradox lay his strength. Rome thrived on such figures, men who embodied its ruthless efficiency, but Rome also feared them. Power that grows too large begins to cast shadows, and Quietus was no exception. Every victory carved his reputation deeper into stone, but every triumph also made the old aristocracy whisper louder. What if this Berber outsider turned his legions against Rome itself? A hero to the army, yes, but in the Senate halls he was becoming a problem too large to ignore. Imagine yourself in that moment. Would you celebrate such a man as savior, or would you start plotting how to remove him before he grew unstoppable? The storm that would define his legacy came with the outbreak of the Quietus War. Across the eastern provinces, rebellion flared like wildfire, threatening to undo everything Trajan had fought for. And when chaos spreads, Rome always turns to its most ruthless weapon. That weapon was Lucius Quietus. His campaign was merciless, and the sources do not hide it. Entire communities were cut down, cities burned, populations slaughtered in the thousands. To many, he was the savior who restored Roman control through sheer terror. To others, he was a butcher whose name became synonymous with massacre. In fact, the very term Quietus War is a corruption of Quietus's name, a grim reminder that the blood spilled was forever linked to him. This is where the contradiction of his life sharpened. Hero or executioner, loyal servant or tyrant in waiting. Even his admirers could not ignore the trail of devastation he left behind, and yet Rome rewarded him, elevating him further, making him governor of Judea. But tell me, if you had been in his place, faced with rebellion, lives of thousands on the line, would you have acted with the same iron hand, or would you have risked Rome's power to spare its enemies? As governor of Judea, Quietus tightened his grip with the same relentless precision that had defined all his campaigns. Rebel strongholds were reduced to rubble, leaders executed, and order restored under a reign of calculated fear. For the common soldiers, he was the embodiment of Rome's will, a commander who did not hesitate, who ensured survival through dominance. Yet in Rome itself, the whispers grew louder. Senators and aristocrats saw not just a general, but a rival whose loyalty was bound more to the legions than to the Senate's marble walls. A foreign-born man with victories carved into monuments and soldiers who would follow him to the ends of the earth. Wasn't that the recipe for a coup? The irony was sharp. The very qualities that had made him indispensable now marked him as a danger. And here is the question. If you were a senator, watching an outsider rise to unmatched power, would you try to befriend him, or would you begin plotting his downfall before it was too late? When Emperor Trajan died in 117, the empire shifted overnight. His successor, Hadrian, was everything Trajan was not. Where Trajan had chased expansion, Hadrian sought retreat. He abandoned territories won with blood, pulled legions back, and reshaped policy with a colder, narrower vision of Rome. And in that vision, there was no room for Lucius Quietus. Almost immediately, Hadrian stripped him of the Moorish cavalry that had been his shield and his power base for decades. Without his men, Quietus was exposed, a lion declawed before the hunt even began. To the Senate, this seemed deliberate, an emperor cutting down a rival before he grew too dangerous. To Quietus, it must have felt like betrayal by the state he had served with brutal devotion. What would you have thought in his place? Cling to loyalty and hope the storm passed, or take the risk of striking first before your enemies finished the job? The year was 118, and the trap finally closed. Hadrian's prefect, Attianus, announced that he had uncovered a conspiracy threatening the emperor's life. 4 senators, all veterans of Trajan's circle, were named as traitors. Among them was Lucius Quietus. But this was no fair trial, no chance to stand before peers and defend a lifetime of service. The accusation itself was enough, because the crime was not a deed, but a possibility. Being too powerful, too respected, too dangerous to be allowed to live. Quietus's victories, once his greatest defense, now stood as proof of his guilt. Soldiers who had once shouted his name now watched in silence as the state turned on him. He was hunted down, executed swiftly, erased as if he had never existed. No grand speech, no chance to look his accusers in the eye, just a political purge, cold and efficient. And so I ask you, what is worse, to die in flames before a roaring crowd, or to vanish quietly, discarded by the empire you had devoted your entire life to? And this is where legend took over. The silent murder of a great general was not enough for storytellers, so whispers grew into something monstrous. They claimed Lucius Quietus had not been struck down quietly, but flayed alive before a jeering crowd, his skin torn away as a warning to anyone who dared rise too high. The tale spread, embellished by time, repeated until it became more terrifying than the truth. Yet the real punishment was even colder. Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. His victories were diminished, his name erased, his story reduced to rumor and fear. Rome didn't just kill him, it tried to unmake him. Think about that. Is it worse to suffer a death of unimaginable agony, or to be stripped of existence itself, forgotten by the very empire you bled for? Let me know what you think, because the story of Lucius Quietus is not just about one man. It's about how power decides who is remembered and who is erased forever.